President, for the opportunity to speak on this important motion. If there is a paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this. A description of Kashmir that rings true to this day. How then is it possible that we have allowed paradise to become marred by conflict, a conflict which shows no sign of ending? Despite what side proposition I have argued, the solution to this conflict is not an independent Kashmir. Not only is it logistically impossible, but it would simply not solve the issues that plague the area. Even worse, it would likely only induce further instability in the region, as well as sow the seeds for extremism and terrorism to become normalized in the pursuit of independence, something we simply cannot afford to risk. The proposition have argued that an independent Kashmir would allow its people to finally exercise their right to self-determination. They've invoked the United Nations resolutions from 1948 that have called for a plebiscite in Kashmir. However, we must remember that this resolution was based on both India and Pakistan withdrawing their military presence from the region, a condition that no side has met. The geopolitical reality has changed significantly since then. The plebiscite was not held because both countries refused to budge. And today, with entrenched military presences on both sides of the line of control, it is even more unrealistic. Moreover, if we are to consider self-determination as a principle, we must also ask, self-determination for who? Kashmir is not a homogeneous entity. As has been pointed out, the region consists of different religious and ethnic groups, and with varying aspirations. The predominantly Muslim Kashmir Valley might lean towards independence or even accession to Pakistan. But what about Jammu, which has a Hindu majority? Or Ladakh with its Buddhist sections? These regions have long sought greater integration with India rather than separation. An independent Kashmir would not represent all these groups equally and would likely lead to further fragmentation along religious and ethnic lines. Simply defining what would be included in this new independent state of Kashmir would be an impossible task. As has been mentioned, it is not just India and Pakistan, but China as well that maintains a presence. There is no guarantee that after independence, Kashmir would not be the subject of yet more scrutiny, particularly from Pakistan, who would feel that they have got one step closer to annexing sections of Kashmir. Even if all three agreed to part ways with some land to an independent Kashmir, it is difficult to argue there would be any tangible benefits. Being sandwiched in a valley between three nuclear powers is uncomfortable at the best of times. For a newly formed state, it would be akin to signing a death warrant. Forever in the shadow of these larger rivals, it would be reliant on its new neighbors economically, politically, and militarily. They would be at the mercy of other international powers and would likely face pressure from all sides to conform to their wishes and beliefs. It would dramatically increase the chances of foreign, particularly Western, intervention in the region, a tale as old as time. With no coastline, limited natural resources, an independent Kashmir would lack access to international trade, essential resources, and economic development. Dependence on neighboring countries and foreign aid would be unavoidable, making genuine independence simply an illusion, and leaving Kashmir vulnerable to coercion from these other states. It would be an unsustainable solution, and one which would mean the state of Kashmir would be destined for struggle and strife. The proposition have also argued that independence could bring peace by removing Indian military presence from the region. But let us not forget what has happened during previous attempts at de-escalation. In 1989, when India reduced its military footprint in the region in response to growing unrest in the Kashmir Valley, it led not to peace, but an armed insurgency backed by Pakistan. This insurgency quickly spiraled into one of the bloodiest conflicts in South Asia's recent history. Thousands of civilians were killed and displaced during this period, including Kashmiri Pandits who were forced into exile from their ancestral homes. It would also be remiss of me not to mention the issues that a potentially independent Kashmir would raise with respect to Khalistan. For those of you unaware, the Khalistan movement refers to the name proposed by some for an independent Sikh state, a movement most prominent in the 1970s and 80s. It culminated, of course, with the assassination of then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi by Sikh bodyguards following her orders to evict armed separatists from the Golden Temple in 1984. Only last year, however, there was a flare-up after the supposed murder of a Canadian Sikh terrorist, prompting fears that this dangerous can of worms might yet be reopened. You do not need me to tell you that allowing Kashmiri independence would simply add fuel to the Khalistani fire. We must not ignore that granting independence to one state sets a naive, irresponsible, and downright dangerous precedent, signaling to separatist groups elsewhere that armed struggle leads to autonomy. Granting independence to Kashmir could encourage a wave of similar demands across India, beginning with Khalistan, destabilizing the country and endangering innocent civilian lives in the future. As the proposition have noted, in 2019, Article 370 was revoked by the Indian government. Only time will tell whether this revocation will have the intended effect. I, for one, believe that acknowledging the unique nature of the Kashmir region is integral to constructive debate. What is important, however, is that regardless of whether or not you agree with Article 370, independence is simply not a feasible alternative. One of the great sources of both national and personal pride is the secular nature of India, a fact that is enshrined in the Constitution from the partition of 1947. No other country can claim to house and represent such an amalgamation of cultures, traditions, and beliefs. Why then would we seek to break this apart and destroy the very essence of India? Finally, let us consider what kind of government might emerge in an independent Kashmir. The proposition might argue it will be democratic governance, but history suggests otherwise. When Sheikh Abdullah first advocated for greater autonomy within India, he was jailed by Nehru's government. Later attempts at democratic reforms were similarly thwarted, leading many disillusioned groups towards militancy instead. Given this track record, how can we expect democracy or stability under conditions far more volatile than before? We would only have ourselves to blame for igniting a powder keg of ethnic and religious tensions. Independence might sound appealing, but the reality would likely be far grimmer for the Kashmiri people. With limited economic infrastructure and trade restrictions from surrounding powers, the new state would struggle to provide even basic services like healthcare, education, and food security, turning an already fraught existence into one of even greater struggle and uncertainty. Kashmir's people have endured an unimaginable hardship, but independence is not the path to their liberation. Instead, we should be pursuing constructive solutions, economic support, political representation, and human rights protections within existing frameworks. If you believe in the beauty of Kashmir, if you wish for prosperity in the region, and if you hope for peace and stability across all of India, then join me in voting in opposition to this motion.